question. I'm originally from Yorkshire in England, as you can probably tell by my accent, and I grew up amid the mills and valleys of the old Industrial Revolution. I attended a comprehensive school in England. That means I was there with all of my mates and all the wonderful working class folks who lived in the area where I grew up. Very early on, I can't really understand why, but I can recall drawing oscillator circuits with a red pen in a book when I was about, I think, 11 years old. And my mum and dad, who didn't have an awful lot of money, nevertheless bought me a nice Philips Electronic Engineer when I was a kid, and I loved playing with that, and Meccano as well. When I was at school in my teenage years, there was one particular chap who kind of influenced me and encouraged me. His name was Powell, Mr. Powell, who taught science. And he also ran a radio club, so that after school we would stay behind and make little radio receivers from single diodes or crystal sets, as we called them in those days. So yeah, that's where I'm from, and that's one chap at least who encouraged me way back when. What got me into the semiconductor industry really was another teacher at my school. He wasn't a teacher of me, he was the headmaster of the school, the comprehensive school that I went to. And his name was Lloyd Harrison. And when I was at school, I always did well. I loved math and I loved physics. And Lloyd Harrison encouraged me to take a year off and then apply to Oxford or Cambridge, which, being from a very working class area, and no one in my family had ever been to university to my knowledge, to have it suggested that I could go to Oxford or Cambridge was really quite, wow, okay, really? And I took a year off, and I won't go into the many details, but suffice it to say that I bumped into this headmaster again after I'd left school, before I went to university. And he said, oh, you should really work for a company called Ferranti. He said, Ferranti do electronics, and I know you're interested in electronics, aren't you? And I said, yeah, I absolutely am. So he encouraged me again to apply to Ferranti in Manchester, and in 1973 I joined the Ferranti Apprentice Training School, learning how to do welding and winding transformers and fitting and running vertical arbor machines and all kinds of exciting things. And then, of course, after the Apprentice Training School, electronics, because they did electronics at Ferranti as well. So I can tell you I got into electronics because I was at Ferranti, and I was so excited to find people who professionally did what I did as a hobby. And so after I left Oxford with a degree in physics, I decided to not follow physics, even though I joined the Physics Institute. I decided not to follow physics and instead go into electronic engineering. And that was way back in 1978. And I've been doing electronic engineering ever since then. Yes, I'm older than I look. Right, what excites me the most about SiliconIntervention and the future of analog design? It's an interesting thing. Analog design, if looked at from the outside, might seem to be a dying art. And the reason for that is that we live in a world dominated by digital. In marketing things to us as consumers, we've learned that digital is new and good and analog is old and bad. But in truth, most of the modern world around us is enabled by analog, not by digital. Right now I'm being recorded by a camera, and the camera is an analog device. And transmitting data on a radio to get your internet, that is an analog device. So what excites me about silicon intervention and analog design now in the 2020s is that we have undergone a kind of change of mindset as to what analog design is and the way it should be done. We can now begin to do analog design using concepts that were completely unavailable to us when I started out. When I started out, an analog circuit might consist of maybe 20 or 30 devices, and we were so proud of how well we could cause these few devices to interact. And the function that resulted from the few devices that interacted was, as it were, predictable. We knew the goal, we knew how to put the devices together, and we knew from simulations or mathematics or back-of-the-envelope scratchings that the functionality we desired would be possible from that connection of 20 or 30 devices. Well, that methodology ran out of steam when the devices became so small and so advanced that frankly they weren't very predictable. They are very variable. It's very hard to build a beautiful elaborate thing when the elements with which you're building it are fuzzy and imprecise and vary from one example to another. So a new area that we're working in silicon intervention asks this question. With thousands and thousands, nay, in fact, even millions of devices, can you get them to interact in a way that gives rise to a useful function by simply the complex way in which they are connected together? So now we're enabling analog designers to work not with 20 or 30 transistors, but with 100,000 or even 1 million devices. We're giving them the tools, the techniques, the insight, the methodology that will allow them to play in a new playing field. We'll be able to employ our analog design skills and our particular way of thinking to functions that arise from complex systems, so-called emergent properties. And that is really, really exciting, because now we don't know what the boundaries are. We've kind of opened up this playing field and we can see, oh my goodness, some principles new to me seem to give me functionality I desire. Analog functions like cameras and signal processing and voice recognition, operating in an analog domain as emergent properties of hundreds of thousands of devices. And for a guy like me, when the doors fling open and you run out there into this playing field and you cannot see the far end of it, you're at the beginning of something, and it's terribly exciting. So silicon intervention, I get up in the morning because silicon intervention is a vehicle that will allow me and a team of people who I recruit into silicon intervention to really explore a fundamentally new area. And like all things, exploring math or exploring fundamentally new areas for its own sake is really good if you've got some financial means behind you. But to explore a new area and do new things which mean something to people, which one day you may have in your cell phone, one of these emergent properties of analog systems in a cell phone, that's really exciting. Thinking that, hey, my daughters, my granddaughters, my wife might use this technology in her devices, in their devices, that's really exciting. That's what silicon intervention is really about. Okay, who are my inspirations, role models, teachers, etc.? Well, they fall really into two categories. The way that I learned to do analog design is by what English people sometimes call sitting with Nelly. And what that means is that you cannot necessarily identify a textbook, or indeed you cannot necessarily identify a university professor who taught you a certain thing, but you realise as you go through your early stages of your career that you're picking things up from being with the people who do the job that you're wanting to do. So you learn by, as I say, the English call it sitting with Nelly, meaning sitting with the person who does it. So that's the first category of people, and I'll name some names in a minute. But a second category of people is actually nothing to do with electronics. The second category is really trying to understand what the nature of innovation is. Trying to ask, what is it about those people who broke the mould? Can we learn anything from their behaviours and what we can read of them? If they're still with us, we might be able to ask them. But if they're not with us, we can read about how perhaps they made progress. So let me go back to the folks with whom I have sat and done electronics. In England, I worked in Ferranti with some people who did really, I now know looking back, breakthrough innovations in electronic design. Uncommitted logic arrays, which were there long before Xilinx, for example, were done in England. So the people in England who did those things and who added analog functionality to uncommitted logic arrays, I learnt a lot from those guys. I shared an office with a guy called Dickie Davis, who designed a sigma delta modulator in 1977. And so I had an insight into sigma delta modulators watching him work. But really, I have to say that I began on a very rapid upward slope, learning more and more, when I moved to analog devices in Boston. In the early days of analog devices, at least I can say this, it was very driven by the engineering teams there. And I will never forget my interactions with a wonderful chap called Paul Brokaw, from whom I learned a lot in a very interesting way. Paul has a very playful way of doing things and describing things. From a chap called Peter Holloway, who was extremely innovative and embodied the kind of paradigm-breaking methodologies of how to think about things. And a chap called Barry Gilbert, who was a fellow Englishman who'd come over to America long before me. And I think I need say no more about Barry Gilbert. He's a very well-known individual. Sadly, he's passed away now. So in terms of electronics, it was the engineering staff and people I worked with at Analog Devices from whom I learned a lot. But in terms of what's the secret sauce, meaning, all right, Martin, well, good job, but we can't all be sitting with the Brokaws, the Holloways and the Gilberts. What else might one do to learn? Well, I think the trick lies in a spiteful, meaning a kind of a deliberate desire to not accept the standard paradigm, to be an annoying little child and keep saying, why do we do it like this? What's the reason for that? Long-tail pair, amplifier, output stage. Why do we do it like that? And a technique that I use when I come across something complex and new to me is, first of all, teach yourself not to be intimidated by it. We all have a gut reaction. When we see something complex that is foreign to us, our gut reaction is, oh, I don't like that. When I say to people, oh, I love mathematics, they say, oh, I hated mathematics. I'm like, fundamentally, why? So, step one, teach yourself to not be intimidated by new things. New things are exciting, new things are wonderful, new things are an opportunity to learn. and then go back to a time before there was that new thing and ask who invented that new thing, what world did he live in, what problem was he solving? Why did the Cooley-Tukey algorithm come out of those two chaps, Cooley and Tukey? What were they doing? Why did they try to do that? And you can learn a lot. They worked for the military. They were trying to detect explosions and needed a methodology to determine where bombs had gone off and things like that. And that will give you a little bit of an excitement and a little bit of confidence of knowing that, hey, those smart people, there was a time before they knew it. And then they went down a path and came up with it. Let me see if I can understand the path that they took down there. But another thing is a little bit of distance from the problem. I'm going to tell you something now which is really quite shocking. I try not to read a lot of electronics books because I subscribe to the idea that if you spend a lot of time engaged in the traditional ways of doing things, your mind will be unable to escape from that modus operandi, that way of working. Even Einstein said that. Einstein said the mind is like a beach and every thought runs on the beach and leaves a little trail so that the next thought tends to go down the same way. So I deliberately try not to read a lot of electronics books because I fear it will force me to go down a certain route. Instead, I read everything around electronics. So currently, I am reading a book by Roger Penrose, talking about the Riemann sphere and something called twistors. And as I read Penrose's book, where he is talking about the structure of space and time, I can see that his mapping onto the Riemann sphere has a relevance to electronics. I can see that what we do in electronics is consider the complex plane to be just that, a plane, and we have little rules about how things must remain in a certain area on the plane. But when you read what Penrose is doing he's trying to understand the structure of the universe and has discovered a very powerful technique called the Riemann sphere, which goes back to the 1930s, goes back a long time. You can suddenly see that, oh, I see why he did that. Because then he can treat infinity as a point. What might that mean to me doing electronics? So there is but one example. Another example is Omar Khayyam. Omar Khayyam in the 12th century was trying to predict the months, the beginning of the Muslim months. And it's very difficult to do that. It's not a simple thing. We think it is. We think it's just equal to the phases of the moon. That's not quite enough. You need to know a little bit more about where the sun sets. And the fact that the moon is not quite on the ecliptic, it leads to an error. And Omar Khayyam came up with an algorithm which he described for calculating where the moon is and the days and the months. And that algorithm turns out to be a first-order delta modulator. So sitting in Dickie Davis's office in Ferranti in the 1970s, and then discovering, when I came to America, that everybody was into sigma delta modulators, or they were getting into sigma delta modulators. Crystal Semiconductor was doing it. And then realizing this technique goes back a long way. It just gives you a sense of confidence and a sense of, oh yeah, this is that thing. Let me see what I can learn about it. I'm not sure that answers really your question. But what I would say is you learn a lot by sitting with Nelly. You have to engage with other people who are doing the job, understand how they think, quiz them, keep saying why. Don't focus too heavily on reading the books. Reading the books will give you the conclusion. It will not give you the thought process that led to that conclusion. Read widely. in areas around what you're studying and see what overlaps there are between one thing and another. Forgive me, this answer is getting terribly, terribly long. But when I was at Oxford, in the 70s, there was a professor called Neville Robinson. And Neville Robinson was ex-Bell Labs, and he'd come to England, to Oxford. He was at St Catherine's College. And I was at New College, and my tutor sent me to St Catherine's College to have tutorials with Professor Robinson, who I later knew as Neville Robinson. And he basically said, you like electronics, don't you, Mr. Mallinson? I said, yes, indeed, Dr. Robinson, I do. And he said, well, then we will tackle some physics problems from an electronic analogy. How about that? And I said, yeah, that sounds really helpful. He said this, he said to me, your insight into electronics will then guide you to solve these physics problems. And at the time, I didn't think anything of that. I thought, oh yeah, that's right. But now looking back, I see he hit the nail on the head. If you spend a lot of time in a certain subject, you'll develop an unspoken insight. And if you can leverage that insight, that is how you can invent new things, get things done. Besides designing electronics, what are my other interests and hobbies? Well, everything. I mean, let me tell you what I am reading right now. I have 4 books on the go at the moment. The first one is volume 5 of Gibbon's Decline of Rome. The history of the decline of Rome that Gibbon wrote in the 18th century, and I'm making my way through book number 5, and it's absolutely fascinating. So I love history and seeing how things evolved. The other book I'm reading at the moment, I already mentioned. It's a record of lectures given by Penrose and the other gentleman from Cambridge, whose name escapes me at the moment, who were writing about the structure of space and time, and I find that absolutely fascinating. The other book I'm reading is a book on mental disease. It's a book on modern medicine and how it might treat mental illnesses and how it all works. And the other book I am currently rereading is a marvellous book on quantum mechanics that describes in wonderful detail. Resnick is the author, if I'm not mistaken. And I am reading that. However, whenever I am on an airplane, travelling between cities, I don't do much these days, I tend to read poetry. I love to read that. I really enjoyed some of the classic books like Abelhard and Eloise. I enjoyed reading that. It was very interesting. And Montaigne. Read about what his essays, which are very interesting. So probably, if you're now watching this, you're thinking, well, oh my goodness, I was hoping Martin would give me some secret sauce to learn how to do analog electronics. And I probably just ended up suggesting to you that you have to do all these things. You certainly don't. You certainly don't. It's just as one gets older, you realise absolutely everything is interesting. And we live in our heads. And you only need engage a passion for something. Just become passionate about analog electronics, history, anything. Just become passionate. If there's one thing that I could tell you is, do not fear saying, I don't know. When you come across something, just say, I have no idea. I don't know. Because by saying you don't know, you give someone else an opportunity to tell you what they know. And don't be intimidated. I had a comment recently said to me in a little lecture that I was giving, "Oh, that I don't like studying that, that's too complicated." I'm like, well, if it was trivial, would you like studying it? Do you see what I'm saying? Don't be intimidated by complexity. Complexity is fascinating, it's wonderful, it's a new area where you might wish to explore. Don't be afraid of saying no. We're not in a competition. That's what I hate about this modern world. We're not in a competition to be number one. We're all on the world seeking something that lights our candle, seeking something that at the end of our lives we'll look back on and say, hey, you know, I wasn't too bad, I did that. And the degree to which we think we're in a competition is distracting. What was the question again? One of my other interests and hobbies. I love astronomy. I have an astronomical observatory on the roof of this house. I love riding my motorcycle. I love reading. I love things. All right.